On the morning of August 17, 1942, a formation of 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from an airfield in England and flew east toward the railway marshalling yards at Rouen in occupied France. It was the first American heavy bomber mission of the European War. The crews were young. Most of them had never been in combat. The aircraft they flew had been built in factories that 18 months earlier had been making automobiles and trucks and farm equipment. General Ira Eaker, who commanded the 8th Air Force and who had staked his professional reputation on the argument that American heavy bombers could fight their way through German air defenses without fighter escort, watched the formation disappear into the morning haze over the English Channel and waited. All 12 aircraft came back. The bombing was not particularly accurate. The crews had practiced over the American desert, not over the industrial cities of Europe, and the difference between a training run and a combat mission with Focke-Wulf 190s coming through the formation was not something any training program had fully prepared them for. But they came back. And Eaker, who understood that the argument he was trying to win was not a tactical argument but a strategic one, sat down and wrote a report that his superiors in Washington read with the specific relief of men who had been told for months by their British counterparts that American daylight bombing doctrine was a theory that would not survive contact with the Luftwaffe. He said the mission had proven the concept was sound. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely right. What Eaker could not know on the morning of August 17, 1942, writing his report in the quiet of an English afternoon, was that the argument he thought he had won would nearly destroy his Air Force before it was settled. That the men in those 12 aircraft were the beginning of a chain of human experience that would run through 2 years of catastrophic losses and technological revolution and the most systematic destruction of an enemy's industrial base in the history of warfare. What he also could not know was that the factories building the aircraft his crews flew were in the process of becoming something that no air force in the history of the world had ever possessed behind it. Not a weapons producer. A weapons factory. The distinction mattered more than anyone in that English headquarters, or in Berlin, or in Tokyo, understood in August of 1942. In January of that year, 4,000 miles from Eaker's airfield, in a converted automobile plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a Ford Motor Company production engineer named Charles Sorensen was looking at a blueprint of a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber and doing the kind of arithmetic that automotive engineers did without thinking about it. He was counting parts. A standard pre-war automobile had approximately 15,000 individual components. The B-24 Liberator had more than 1 million. Its electrical wiring, if stretched end to end, would run for more than a mile. Its hydraulic system required machining tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Its fuel system had to function at 40 below zero at 30,000 feet. Its engines, 4 of them, had to synchronize within parameters that were not tolerances in any automobile sense but in an engineering sense that left no margin for the kind of variation that mass production inevitably introduced. The people who built aircraft for a living said it could not be done the way Ford proposed to do it. Sorensen had heard that argument before. He had heard it in 1913, when Henry Ford proposed to build automobiles on a moving assembly line, and every established manufacturer in the industry explained with patient condescension why that was not how automobiles were built. He had heard it again in 1932 when Ford decided to cast the V8 engine block as a single piece rather than assembling it from multiple components, and the foundry men said the tolerances required made the idea physically impossible. He had learned to treat that argument as information about where the real problem was, rather than as a reason to stop. Sorensen did not approach the B-24 the way an aircraft manufacturer approached it. He approached it the way he had approached every manufacturing problem for 30 years. Which was to ask a single question. What is the process, and how do you make it faster? The answer, in broad terms, was the same answer Ford had found for the automobile. You break the product into components. You manufacture the components simultaneously in different facilities. You bring the components together on an assembly line where each worker performs a single defined task at a defined station and the product moves continuously from one end of the building to the other. You use machinery wherever possible in place of hand labor. You design the tooling so that the worker does not need to be a craftsman, but a trained operator of a specific machine performing a specific task. The established aircraft manufacturers, watching Sorensen's plans take shape at the enormous facility the government was building for Ford outside Ypsilanti, explained again why this approach would not work for aircraft. Aircraft were not automobiles. The design changed constantly. As combat experience revealed problems and engineers developed solutions. Every design change disrupted an assembly line, forced retooling, scrapped inventory. An automobile design could be frozen for a model year. An aircraft fighting a war could not be frozen for an afternoon. Sorensen acknowledged the problem. Then he built an engineering organization of 200 people whose sole job was to translate design changes into tooling modifications as fast as the changes came. When the Army Air Forces revised the B-24's fuel system in October of 1942, Sorensen's engineers had new tooling on the floor in 11 days. When the Air Forces modified the bomb bay doors in January of 1943, the line absorbed the change in 8 days without stopping. When combat reports from the Pacific revealed that the B-24's defensive armament was inadequate in tail positions and the design was revised accordingly, the Willow Run line incorporated the change in 9 days. And never lost a day of production. The press, which had been mocking the facility as Willow Run instead of Willow Run and reporting on the production delays and quality problems of the startup period, stopped finding the story funny sometime in the spring of 1943. Because by the spring of 1943, Willow Run was producing a completed B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Not per day, per hour. One finished heavy bomber, ready to fly, rolling out of a factory in Michigan every 63 minutes around the clock. The men in Berlin who had looked at American peacetime production in 1939 and concluded it could not be converted to meaningful wartime output had made the same mistake in their analysis that they made in almost every other analysis of American capacity. They had measured what America was, not what it could become. They had seen a consumer economy and concluded it was a soft economy. They had seen factories making peacetime products and concluded those factories could not make weapons. What they had not seen, because it had not yet been visible, was what happened to an American industrial system when it was given a specific target, a defined timeline, and the full resources of a continental economy behind it. The target was aircraft. The timeline was as fast as possible. The resources were beyond anything the German industrial planners had a framework to comprehend. Albert Speer, who ran German armaments production from 1942 onward and who was one of the most competent industrial managers in the German government, testified after the war that he had received intelligence estimates on American aircraft production in 1942 and 1943 and had dismissed them as propaganda. Not because he was careless, but because the numbers were outside the range of what he believed a modern industrial economy could produce. They seemed too large to be real. They were real. In 1942, American factories built 47,000 military aircraft. In 1943, they built 85,000. In 1944, they built 96,000. That single year's output exceeded Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war. It exceeded Germany's total aircraft production for the entire war by a margin so large that the comparison barely seems meaningful. Speer, sitting in a prison cell at Nuremberg in 1946, was shown the actual production statistics. He looked at them for a long time. He had known the broad outlines. He had not known the details. The details were worse than he had imagined. He said that if he had understood in 1942 what American production would actually achieve, he would have told Hitler the war was lost before it had really started. He did not say this as an excuse. He said it as a professional assessment. He had spent 4 years fighting a resource war against an opponent whose resources he had systematically underestimated. The men who produced those aircraft were not the men German military planners had imagined when they thought about American workers. German analysis in the pre-war period had built its model of American industrial capacity on a workforce composed largely of immigrant labor with limited skills and doubtful loyalty. The actual workforce that built American airpower was something considerably more complicated. It included women, in numbers that no pre-war industrial planner of any nationality had anticipated. Women entered the American defense industry in 1942 and 1943 and took jobs that had previously been exclusively male. Not in support roles. On the factory floor. Operating lathes and drill presses and welding equipment. Inspecting components to tolerances that required precision and training rather than physical strength. Running assembly operations where the skill required was learned skill rather than inherited craft. By 1944, women made up approximately 38%. of the workforce at Boeing's B-17 production facilities in Seattle. At the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Long Beach, California, which produced more than 10,000 military aircraft during the war, the percentage was higher. At the North American Aviation Plant in Kansas City, where the P-51 Mustang fighter was built in its later variants, women operated many of the most precision-critical machining stations. The government ran propaganda campaigns promoting these women as symbols of the war effort. The imagery became iconic. But the reality behind the imagery was more interesting than the symbol. These were not women performing simplified tasks designed for unskilled labor. They were women performing complex manufacturing operations that had previously been classified as requiring years of apprenticeship and that they had learned in weeks. The learning curve was not as steep as the craft guilds had maintained. That was a discovery with implications that went well beyond the war. It included African American workers. The Great Migration that had brought millions of Black Americans from the rural South to the industrial North in the decades before the war had created a labor pool that the defense buildup drew on at a scale that transformed cities and industries and political calculations simultaneously. Aircraft plants in Detroit and Chicago and Los Angeles hired Black workers in numbers that the previous decade's discriminatory practices had prevented. The Fair Employment Practices Committee, established by Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in June of 1941, provided at least a partial legal framework for challenging discriminatory hiring in defense industries. The reality on the factory floor was messier than the executive order. Discrimination persisted. Black workers were sometimes assigned to specific jobs rather than the full range of positions. Tensions between white and black workers produced incidents, sometimes violent ones, that management had to manage alongside the production problems. The Detroit Race Riot of June 1943, which killed 34 people and required federal troops to suppress, was a reminder that the social changes being accelerated by wartime mobilization were not happening without cost. But the workers came, and they worked, and the aircraft that came off the assembly lines in those factories represented labor that no previous analysis of American production capacity had fully accounted for, because no previous analysis had included the possibility that American industry would actually deploy its full potential workforce. The flight test operations that accepted completed aircraft from the factories and cleared them for delivery to military units were staffed in significant part by women pilots of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. They flew every type of aircraft in the American inventory, including the B-17, the B-24, the B-29, the P-38, the P-47, and the P-51. They flew them from factories to delivery points, freeing male pilots for combat assignments. They flew target towing missions for gunnery training. They tested aircraft after maintenance and repair. They were not soldiers, in the legal classification of the period. They were civil service employees. When a WASP died, her family received no military burial honors, no flag, no government notification of next of kin. Her fellow pilots had to take up collections to ship her body home. 38 WASPs died in service. Their contributions were not recognized by the military for 30 years. The men who were flying the aircraft those factories produced, and those women delivered, were conducting a campaign that had no historical precedent. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which Eaker had launched with 12 aircraft over Rouen in August of 1942, had grown by the summer of 1943 into an operation involving hundreds of aircraft flying multiple missions per week against targets across occupied Europe and Germany itself. The targets were chosen according to a theory of precision daylight bombing that argued for attacking specific industrial bottlenecks rather than the area bombing of cities that the RAF was conducting at night. The theory said, find the critical nodes in the German industrial system, destroy them, and the system will fail. The ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt were the theory's most famous test. The argument for targeting ball bearings was made by a civilian economist named Albert Speer's American counterpart in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Organization, and it rested on a straightforward industrial logic. Ball bearings were used in virtually every piece of rotating machinery in modern industry. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, ships, machine tools. Without ball bearings, nothing moved. And German ball bearing production was concentrated in a handful of facilities, most of them in a single city in Bavaria. If those facilities could be destroyed, German industry would stop. The 8th Air Force mounted two major missions against Schweinfurt, in August and October of 1943. The October mission became the defining disaster of the American bombing campaign and the near death of the daylight precision bombing doctrine. 290 B-17s flew to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. Without fighter escort, which the available fighters did not have the range to provide over a target that deep in Germany. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Over a period of roughly 4 hours, German fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 60 American bombers. 600 men gone in an afternoon. Another 17 aircraft crashed or were written off after landing. Of the 290 aircraft that took off, fewer than 230 were fully operational the next day. The loss rate on the mission was over 20%. A loss rate that could not be sustained for more than a handful of missions before the 8th Air Force ceased to exist as a fighting force. Eaker halted deep penetration missions into Germany. The doctrine appeared to have failed. What happened next is one of the most consequential engineering decisions of the entire war, and it happened not in a general's headquarters or a government ministry but in a design office in Inglewood, California, where the engineers at North American Aviation were working on a modification to a fighter aircraft that had been considered mediocre when it was first delivered. The P-51 Mustang had been designed in 1940 for the British, who needed a fighter quickly and contracted with North American to produce one in an unusually short time frame. The aircraft North American produced was aerodynamically clean and handled well, but its Allison engine lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet, which made it unsuitable for the kind of high-altitude escort work that European air combat required. The British used it for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance. The Americans largely ignored it. In the autumn of 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang and came back with a specific suggestion. Replace the Allison engine with the Merlin. The Merlin, which powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane and the Lancaster, maintained its power at altitude. In a way the Allison did not. An airframe as clean as the Mustang's, with an engine as capable as the Merlin, might produce a fighter with performance characteristics that nothing currently flying could match. The suggestion was pursued. The modified aircraft flew in October of 1942. The test pilots who flew it reported numbers that seemed too good to be accurate and proved to be accurate when checked. The P-51B with the Merlin engine had a top speed of 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. It was faster than the Focke-Wulf 190 at altitude. Its range, extended by a system of drop tanks that could be jettisoned when combat began, was sufficient to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. Not to the Dutch border. Not to the Rhine. To Berlin. This was the solution to the problem that had nearly destroyed the 8th Air Force at Schweinfurt. The Mustangs reached operational squadrons in the winter of 1943 and 1944. By February of 1944, enough of them were available that the 8th Air Force could resume deep penetration missions into Germany with fighter escort all the way to the target and all the way back. The missions of Big Week in February 1944, targeting German aircraft production, used Mustang escorts that engaged the Luftwaffe over the target areas in the way that the Thunderbolt pilots over France had engaged it closer to England. The Luftwaffe rose to defend. It had to. The alternative was to allow American bombers to destroy German aircraft factories unmolested. The fighter battles that resulted were not the kind of engagements the Luftwaffe had been winning over the Reich since 1942. Over Germany, against the American day fighters in the winter and spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots were being destroyed at rates that its training pipeline could not replace. Not because the Mustang was so much better than the Focke-Wulf, though it was better, and not because American pilots were so much more skilled, though by the spring of 1944 the experience gap was narrowing. But because the Americans could absorb the losses and keep sending aircraft, and the Germans could not absorb equivalent losses without degrading their ability to defend their own airspace. The factories in Michigan and California and Kansas were the reason. In the spring of 1944, North American Aviation's plants were producing Mustangs faster than trained pilots could be provided to fly them. The constraint on American airpower over Germany was not aircraft. It was men. The constraint on German airpower was everything simultaneously. Aircraft, fuel, trained pilots. The synthetic fuel plants that produced aviation gasoline were being bombed systematically from the spring of 1944 onward, and by the autumn German pilots were flying training sorties on schedules reduced by fuel shortage to fractions of what American pilots flew in their training programs. Young Luftwaffe pilots were being sent to operational units with less than half the flying hours that their American opponents had accumulated before entering combat. In the summer of 1942, that gap had run in the opposite direction. German pilots in France had 3 years of combat experience. American pilots arriving in England had none. The gap had been one of the most important factors in the disasters of the early 8th Air Force missions. By the summer of 1944, the factories had reversed it. The men who never got sufficient credit for this reversal were not the generals who commanded the bombing campaign or the politicians who authorized it or even the pilots who flew it. They were the people who decided, in the spring and summer of 1940 when the outcome was genuinely uncertain and the German military appeared to be on the edge of winning the war in Europe, to bet everything on American production. Roosevelt made the political bet. His industrial advisors, men like William Knudsen who had run General Motors and understood what American factories could do when directed toward a specific target, made the production bet. The engineers at Boeing and Douglas and North American and Consolidated made the engineering bets, one after another, that turned theoretical production targets into actual aircraft sitting on actual runways. The men and women on the factory floor made it real. In the end, what defeated the Luftwaffe over Germany in 1944 was not primarily the skill of American pilots or the quality of American aircraft, though both mattered. It was the fact that behind every American pilot in the spring of 1944 there was another pilot in training, and behind every aircraft there was another aircraft coming off an assembly line, and behind every assembly line there was a factory that was producing at a rate that the German High Command had looked at in intelligence reports and classified as propaganda because the numbers were too large to be real. The numbers were real. They were always real. Ira Eaker, the man who had started with 12 aircraft over Rouen in August of 1942, ended the war commanding the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces and watching American aircraft operating from Italian bases strike targets in southern Germany and Austria that he had not dreamed of reaching from England in the dark months of 1942. He had been right about the doctrine, in the end. Not in the form he had originally proposed it. The unescorted daylight bombing theory had cost more than he had promised it would cost. But the corrected version, with long-range escort fighters and the production capacity to absorb losses that would have destroyed a less productive air force, had done what he said it would do. It had destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. It had done it by the spring of 1944, in time for the Normandy invasion to proceed under an air umbrella that the Germans could not penetrate. Charles Sorensen retired from Ford in 1944. He had built Willow Run from a flat Michigan field into a factory producing 1 B-24 per hour. He received a letter from the War Department thanking him for his contribution. He thought it was somewhat inadequate recognition for what had been accomplished. He was probably right about that too.